Hi, everyone. I'm going to give you a lecture based on today's reading for Wednesday, June 10th. It will be on um, pages, I believe I've assigned pages 26 to 36 from Kant. This is the second reading out of three for Kant. And today we're going to talk a lot about the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. A lot more jargon that Kant is going to throw at you to try to make sense of his ethical theory. But really, what he's saying is actually not all that difficult. Once you kind of have it explained in simpler terms, what Kant is saying is not really that um, out there, even though trying to penetrate through the jargon is not always easy. So, anyways, where did we leave off with the lecture from yesterday? Um, we left off talking about what it means to act from duty. Um, and again, duty is the special name that Kant gives to acting morally when we are motivated solely from um, the motive of duty. When that is the only reason that we have performed an action, that is considered a moral choice for Kant. So the easiest way to see that is in the example of helping someone in need. It's not enough to simply want to help someone in need. Wanting to help is acting upon a desire. Um, and the problem with desire is that it is contingent. We may or may not feel that desire to help. Not every human being will feel that desire. And so we need to have a motivation that is not contingent. And that motivation is duty. The motivation, now, not everyone, again, will experience that motivation to help, but the fact that we don't experience it and the fact that lots of people are not nice people and don't help their friends doesn't mean that morality's requirements don't apply to us. Morality's requirements apply to us unconditionally, independent of our wants, desires, and inclinations. Um, and so that is the distinction. Now, again, wanting to help is not an immoral motivation. It would be, kicking your friend who needs help and turning your back and walking the other way. That would be the immoral thing. Um, um, Wanting to help is noble. It's a good thing. We want people to want to help, but it doesn't have moral worth. But it does not have immoral worth either. It's somewhere in between those two. We must be motivated solely from the maxim of being obligated to help. And again, our maxim is our reason for choosing to perform a certain action. That maxim must be that you ought to help because it is required of you. And that is the moral maxim. Okay, so that was a little bit of a review. Today's reading picks up, and I'm drawing here on the Course Guard introduction. If you take a look at the syllabus, I've assigned certain portions of the introduction written by this lady named Christine Korsgaard. She is someone who has a PhD in philosophy. She wrote the introduction to this book, which helps break Kant down in more simpler terms. And I've assigned certain parts of that to you for today as well. And so I'm drawing on what she's doing here. And what she says is that Kant, um, at the bottom of where I'm starting is at the bottom of page 26 today. The reading begins where Kant says, everything in nature works according to laws. That is where I'm beginning. And with that, Korsgaard suggests that Kant is presenting what she refers to as a theory of practical reasoning. Now, what does she mean by that? Well, all that means is practical reasoning is just a kind of reasoning that human beings engage in. Now, there's also just theoretical reasoning, which is reasoning in order to know something. So, engaging in a proof in a math class is theoretical reasoning. You are reasoning in order to know. But there's also practical reasoning, which is reasoning in order to act. Um, and whether or not you realize it, you engage in practical reasoning all of the time. Um, when you are making choices and engaging in certain kinds of actions, you are engaged in practical reasoning. That you have, for example, a basic way of thinking about this is that you have something you want to achieve, and you have to figure out how you're going to achieve that thing. So you, in your mind, you think about, well, I could do it this way, and I could do it this way. This way has this advantages. This way has this advantages. While you're doing that, you are engaged in practical reasoning. Pro and con lists are an example of practical reasoning. Not all practical reasoning is moral reasoning. There are lots of actions and choices that we make that have nothing to do with morality. Um, so we're going to get a lot of that today in this distinction between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. But the reason we're getting this theory of practical reasoning is that Kant wants to give us what it's like to make a moral choice versus what it's like to make some other kind of choice. And so Kant's going to give us this language of imperative for what it's like to engage in practical reasoning, to engage in reasoning about how we ought to act. And that's the key, ought. Because morality is about the choices we ought to make, not about the choices we do make. And so that's why this language of imperative is important. Kant is going to define imperative on page 27 here. I know that's not especially helpful for you, but I'm on page 27 here in the text, where it says, the representation of an objective principle insofar as it is necessitating for a will is called a command, and the formula of the command is called an imperative. So why does Kant talk about practical reasoning in terms of commands and imperatives? Well, the reason is because human beings are subject to different competing forces. We are subject to reason, which tells us the things that are good for us and the things that we ought to do that would make us happy, for example. We are also subject to desires that affect us, that we are not necessarily in control of. And so desires come along and pull us in directions that we might not want to go in. And so what we have to do when we make a choice for Kant is we have to constrain ourselves. We have to command ourselves to do what we ought to do, even though we might not want to do it. And so that is why Kant calls that's why practical reasoning takes the form of a command for Kant, because of the very nature of the kinds of creatures that we are, as creatures that are subject to desires, creatures that don't automatically do the things that we ought to do. We experience desire saying, don't do this. I don't want you to do this. Do something else instead, even though we might think, no, it's a bad idea. So that's why Kant calls So practical reasoning takes the form of commands and imperatives because human beings are subject to desire. Now, Kant says that there are two forms that these commands take. The commands either take the form of a hypothetical or they take the form of a categorical. And so on page 28, Kant says, now, all imperatives command, either hypothetically or categorically. The former represent the practical necessity of a possible action, as a means to achieving something else that one wants. The categorical imperative would be the one that represented an action as necessary by itself without reference to some further end. So hypothetical imperatives are if-then statements. They say, if you want this thing, if you want to achieve X, then you ought to do X. They're not necessary. You don't have to do the thing in question. But if you, on any given day, all of you have something you want to achieve. And in order to achieve that thing, you think to yourself, well, what should I do? Well, I should do this. And so that is a hypothetical imperative. When you say to yourself, if I want to wake up, then I ought to stop snoozing my alarm. There you go. If I want to wake up, if I want to get out of bed, then I should stop hitting snooze on the alarm. Now, you ought to stop hitting snooze. That doesn't mean that you will, and that also presupposes that you want to get out of bed. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to stay in bed. So that's just every day these hypothetical imperatives come along, and they have nothing to do with morality. Some of them will, some of them could, but many of them don't. And so Kant gives us different kinds of hypothetical imperatives. On page, I'm trying to find the different kinds. So Kant gives us different kinds of hypothetical imperatives on page 30. He gives us ones that are called rules of skill. So often when I teach this in class, I usually have students who play sports. And immediately you recognize that one of the things that you need to do in order to be good at the sport you're playing is to practice. So as a general rule, if you want to be good at, let's say, tennis. I don't know how many of you play tennis. See, this is why an online course isn't as good, because I don't have, but let's say you play tennis. And if you want to be good at tennis, then you ought to practice. The goal is to be good at tennis. The rule you give yourself for being good at tennis, the rule you give yourself is that you ought to practice. So the if X, then Y statement. It is a hypothetical imperative. Now, why does Kant call it hypothetical? Well, it's hypothetical because you may not want to play tennis. Lots of people have different sports that they're good at. So hypothetical imperatives presuppose a desire to do the thing. You are dependent on your desire to want to do something. And maybe you don't want to play tennis. Maybe you want to play something else. But you can have it as a general rule that if you want to be good at a sport, then you ought to practice. Again, you may not want to be good at a sport. So there's no harm, no foul here. This is just, as a general rule, this is what practical reasoning looks like. If any goal that you have, there's going to be something you ought to do to achieve it. Okay. Kant gives other examples about different kinds of hypothetical imperatives. I'm not going to go into those here, but you get the general idea. But the point is, morality cannot take the form of a hypothetical imperative. So to go back to the example, because hypothetical imperatives are conditional, they depend upon you, all of you listening, having a desire in the first place to do something. That's what hypothetical imperatives presuppose, that you have to have the desire in the first place. But morality is unconditional, necessary, and universal for Kant. The requirements of morality are unconditional, which is to say they don't depend upon you wanting to do them. So to go back to the friend example, we might say that the hypothetical imperative would be, if I want to feel good, then I ought to help my friend. Well, again, the moral thing to do is to help your friend, period. regardless of what you want to do. So morality cannot take the form of hypotheticals because morality's requirements, its commands, are unconditional and necessary. They exist independent of us. And so that's why categorical imperatives are unconditional. So that's the distinction. Categorical is not if you want to do X, then you, or if I want to be good at sports, then I ought to practice. Categorical imperatives just simply say you ought to do X, period. You ought to help your friend. That is a categorical imperative, period. It doesn't say, it doesn't ask what you want. It doesn't ask about your desires. It simply says you need to help your friend because morality requires it of you, that you are obligated to help your friend by the very nature of morality. And so there's the difference, right? So the categorical imperatives are going to be the moral imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives have nothing to do with morality, but categorical imperatives do. And what is categorical? Something that is, I'm trying other, there's other contexts where we use the language of categorical. We say that that I am, that it is categorically true. That is true without exception, unconditionally true. So those are the synonyms for categorical. Now, Kant is going to say that there is actually there are particular categorical imperatives, such as you ought to tell the truth, you ought to help your friend. Those are particular categorical imperatives, but we can derive those from a formula that Kant calls the categorical imperative. And that appears for the first time on page 34. So at the top of 34, Kant gives us the categorical imperative. He says, there is therefore only a single categorical imperative. And it is this: act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So there's a lot there. And in particular, I want to encourage you to make sure, in order to really understand what I'm going to say here in the next couple minutes, please take a look on Canvas at the notes. In particular, take a look at what I've titled Categorical Imperative Supplement for Examples. This is going to give you what really is going on here when Kant is talking about a formula for trying to figure out what kinds of choices we should make. And the easiest way to see how this formula works and how you should use this formula is to look at the first example. And this example appears on page 35. It's example 2 when Kant is talking about somebody who needs to borrow money from their friend. This will give you how the categorical imperative is supposed to work. In other words, the categorical imperative is supposed to function as a kind of formula or procedure for how you could determine whether the choice that you want to make is a moral choice, according to Kant. It can help you figure out whether the action you want to perform and the choice you want to make can function as a moral choice, according to Kant. So I'm going to go through this example real quick. So first of all, within that formula there's the word maxim again, and that is crucial for Kant. A maxim is simply the reason that you are proposing for performing a certain action. So to go to the hypothetical imperative, your maxim would, if you want to be good at sports, then you ought to practice. That would be your maxim there. The reason that you want to perform the action of practicing is that you want to be good at sports. So your maxim is, the reason you're performing the action is to be good at sports. So that is a maxim, a reason for your choice. Now, how does this play out in the context of this example? So the easiest way to see this is Kant says that you have a friend who comes to you and they want to borrow money. Or you go to your friend and you need to borrow money. But you know that you won't be able to pay your friend back. You know that. But you have to tell them that you will pay them back. Otherwise, you won't get the money from them. So you have to lie to your friend. And Kant asks us to imagine whether that rule, if I want